Okay, the final level 1 theory that we're going to look at is the Seto Motivation-Facilitation model. This has gone through a couple of reworkings now, but the most recent version was published in 2019, so just last year. And essentially this is, I think, probably the simplest model to understand, but it incorporates a lot of the ideas that we've already discussed. This is what the model looks like. So it's a fairly straightforward idea in that you have various motivators of sexual offending that lead to a sexual offence, but only within the context or in collaboration with various facilitating concepts. So this is quite a nice model because it doesn't necessarily suggest that just because somebody has a motivating factor, they will commit a sexual offence. And we know that from the literature in relation to minor attraction and paedophilia, for example, we know that a lot of people with these sexual attractions will not commit sexual offences. This kind of model helps us to understand why that is and how maybe that crossover starts to happen. So just to kind of reiterate, we have these motivating factors, paraphilias, these kind of sexual interests that maybe are associated with an increased risk but don't necessarily lead to an offence in a fatalistic way. So paraphilias or high sex drive may motivate people to seek out potentially risky sexual interactions, but also there's intense mating effort as well here. So this is where people are maybe not able to attract the kind of mates that they're interested in. So therefore they look for people that maybe are out of their league, and then they're I don't know, more likely to get rejection, and therefore if anything does happen, that would be non-consensual. Now these things, the presence of these things increase the chance of an offence taking place. So this plus sign here suggests that these things are increasing sexual offence risk. Now that said, it doesn't mean that an offence will happen. An offence will more likely happen in the context of a person who also has facilitating factors. So this is where the motivation and the facilitation comes into this model. Now facilitating factors are internal or external. So they can be internal in terms of personality traits. So the most commonly discussed one is antisocial personality, but we might also conceive implicit theories and cognitive distortions as facilitating factors. Or they can be external, which is the bubble at the bottom, which are more kind of situational, I suppose, in terms of their conceptualization. So internal factors are referred to as trait level, and external factors are referred to as state level. So kind of these temporary issues that might lead someone to maybe fall back on some of those cognitive structures that they hold in terms of their core sexual attractions. Now all of this happens within a given situational context. So this is the only model that really sets the situational aspects in an explicit and central place within the model. So even in the presence of motivating and facilitating factors, so somebody with high levels of paraphilic sexual interest and high levels of antisociality and high levels of alcohol use or drug use or sexual arousal, even that individual will only offend if given the opportunity to within a given situation. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the structure of this theory. With that, we can start to make some assumptions or some hypotheses in relation to different kinds of offences. So if we take paedophilia, for example, as the most commonly studied and most commonly discussed paraphilic sexual attraction pattern. Now what we might suggest is that these interests motivate offending, but it's only in the presence of antisociality maybe that offending becomes a contact offence. So the hypothesis would be that people with paedophilic sexual interests, particularly high levels of paedophilic sexual interest, would be more likely to use child sexual exploitation material as part of their kind of masturbation activities. But that crossover to contact offending will only be present in those who have high levels of antisociality or psychopathy, as well as that paraphilic sexual interest. This kind of approach is what was studied by Kelly Baptician and colleagues. So they did a big review of a number of people, or a number of studies, looking at CSEM use. Several studies, lots of perpetrators within their sample, and what they found was exactly what we've just said. So people who have relatively high levels of paedophilic sexual interest or sexual interest in children are more likely to have child sexual exploitation material offences on their records. Those who are just contact child sexual offenders, so those who are just committing contact offences without having necessarily that high levels of paedophilic sexual interest, they've got low levels of sexual interest in children but higher levels comparatively of antisocial traits. And those who are using CSEM and committing contact sexual offences, so these are the mixed offender groups, have high levels of both. So this is where we see that crossover that I've just been talking about in terms of using both material and engaging in contact sexual offending. So you see this kind of gradual increase in crossover risk as antisociality increases. So here we see this kind of application of the motivation-facilitation model, in that the sexual interest or the sexual attraction pattern motivates some kind of sexual outlet in terms of using CSEM as a form of sexual release, or when kind of engaging in masturbation. But that crossover offending into sexual contact with children only becomes kind of an exaggerated risk at higher levels of antisociality as well. So when in the company of a facilitating factor. Okay, and that really is the motivation facilitation model. This idea that you have motivating factors that only necessarily lead to an offence in the company of a facilitating factor or a set of facilitating factors. And that's the end of the multifactorial models of sexual offending. So what we'll see is that throughout all of these models, what you see are similar kinds of constructs coming forward. So things like the importance of early childhood experiences and developmental experiences, the importance of the internal working model and attachment, not necessarily in terms of just maintaining relationships, but in relation to emotion regulation as well. We see issues around cognitive distortion, so the implicit theories literature, the cognitive distortion literature. How do people make sense of their sexual interests and their sexual behaviours? In relation to those sexual interests, how do we understand potentially deviant or atypical patterns of sexual arousal? But importantly, the thing that really is missing, at least in an explicit way, in a lot of these models, is the opportunity to offend. Obviously, Finkelhor has that in his model. Michael Seto has it in his motivation facilitation model. But there are a lot of conceptual leaps between particular constructs, and therefore there's a sexual offence. A lot of these models have this similar kind of conceptual leap just before the offence is kind of delineated. And this is because we've got this issue around kind of level 3. We don't really understand level 3 in a comprehensive way. We can start to formulate what it looks like for individual perpetrators of sexual violence, but it is an individual process. So there is no one way of getting from emotional congruence with children to offending, for example. That will be individually driven by the situational context and by the personal context of the individual perpetrator that you're trying to understand. So hopefully that makes sense. We're going to now look at two specific forms of sexual offending that don't really have these big multifactorial models at the moment. So we'll first look at rape, and then we'll turn our attention to child sexual exploitation material offending.